Sometimes the smallest thing a person loses is the only thing holding them together. The bracelet rested quietly in Marcus Reed's palm, its thin gold chain catching the dim overhead light like it still remembered being somewhere brighter, somewhere warmer, somewhere it belonged. He stood alone in the service hallway on the 42nd floor, long after the elevators had stopped chiming and the polished shoes had disappeared, his work cart parked beside him, the faint smell of industrial cleaner still clinging to his sleeves. He turned the bracelet once between his fingers, slow and deliberate, not out of curiosity, but out of respect, as if it wasn't just an object, but a story he hadn't been told yet. Hours earlier, the building had been alive with motion, sharp heels crossing marble floors, voices layered over the constant hum of urgency, and at the center of it all was Evelyn Carter, a billionaire CEO who moved through space like it owed her clearance, her presence precise, controlled, untouchable. Marcus had seen people like her before, not in magazines or headlines, but in the way people looked past him, through him, as if he were part of the infrastructure rather than a man with a name, a son waiting at home, and a quiet code he never broke. That morning, his mop had traced clean arcs across the lobby floor, each movement steady, measured, until her path intersected with his. She didn't stop immediately, but when she did, it was subtle, a pause just long enough to register inconvenience, her eyes flicking toward the wet floor sign, then toward him, not angry, not loud, just dismissive. "Is this really the best time for this?" she had said, her voice low but cutting through the space more effectively than a shout ever could, drawing the attention of a few nearby employees who quickly pretended not to notice. Marcus had stepped back without hesitation, pulling the mop aside, creating space, not because he agreed, but because he understood something she didn't have time to consider. "Sorry, ma'am," he said, his tone even, unshaken, not apologizing for existing, just acknowledging the moment. She had already moved on before the words fully landed, her heels echoing across the floor, her phone pressed to her ear, her world continuing without interruption. And then, just for a second, something small had slipped from her coat pocket, unnoticed, unheard, landing near the edge of the freshly cleaned tile. No one saw it fall. No one except Marcus. He had paused, watching the object for a breath longer than necessary before bending down, his movements unhurried, as if rushing would somehow disrespect the moment. When he picked it up, he didn't call out to her, didn't chase after her retreating figure, didn't demand to be seen. Instead, he held on to it, not as leverage, not as opportunity, but as responsibility. Now, standing in the quiet after the day had emptied itself out, Marcus looked at the bracelet one more time before closing his hand gently around it. He didn't need to know its price to understand its value. Some things weren't measured that way. And somewhere above him, behind closed glass doors and guarded silence, a woman who had everything was about to realize she had lost something she couldn't replace. The next morning did not begin with noise, but with absence, the kind that slips in quietly and unsettles everything without announcing itself. Evelyn Carter noticed it not when she entered the building, not when the receptionist greeted her with the same practiced tone, not even when the elevator doors closed and carried her up 42 floors in silence, but when her hand reached instinctively toward her wrist and found nothing there. It was a small motion, almost automatic, but it stopped her mid-step as she exited onto her floor, her fingers hovering in the air for a second longer than they should have. She looked down, expecting to see the thin gold line resting against her skin, but there was only the pale imprint it had left behind, a faint outline where something meaningful had once been. Her expression did not change immediately, but something behind her eyes shifted, something tighter, more focused, as if the day ahead had just been rearranged without her permission. She turned slightly, scanning the hallway as though the bracelet might simply be there, waiting to be noticed, but the floor was spotless, reflective, offering nothing back but her own composed reflection. Inside her office, the city stretched wide beyond the glass, sharp lines and distant movement, but none of it held her attention. Her bag rested on the desk, opened, checked once, then again, each movement more precise than the last, her breathing controlled, but no longer effortless. It was not about the gold, not about the cost, not even about the inconvenience. It was about what the bracelet carried, something private, something she never explained, something she did not allow herself to misplace. Her assistant spoke from the doorway, listing the morning's schedule, meetings, calls, decisions waiting to be made, but Evelyn only nodded, the words passing through her without landing. "Reschedule the 9:30, she said quietly, her voice still steady, still authoritative, but missing its usual sharp edge. "And have security check the lobby footage from yesterday." She did not explain further. She did not need to. Downstairs, the lobby had already returned to its rhythm, footsteps measured, conversations low, everything in its place, including Marcus Reed, who moved through the space with the same quiet consistency, his cart rolling beside him, his focus unchanged. There was no sign in his posture that he carried anything of importance. No urgency, no hidden intention, just the same steady presence that most people overlooked without thinking twice. When people passed him, they did not slow down, did not wonder, did not ask. And that was fine with him. He had learned a long time ago that being unseen was not the same as being unimportant. In the inside pocket of his worn jacket, the bracelet remained, untouched since the night before, not because he had forgotten, but because he had not yet decided the right moment to return it. Not everything needed to be rushed. Some things required timing, not for effect, but for meaning. As he paused near the center of the lobby, adjusting the position of a caution sign by a few inches so it aligned perfectly with the edge of the tile, his eyes lifted briefly toward the elevator doors, watching them open and close, people stepping in and out, lives moving forward without interruption. Somewhere above, a woman who controlled everything was searching for something she could not control anymore. And somewhere below, a man with very little held the one thing she could not replace, not as power, not as leverage, but as a simple choice waiting to be made. By late afternoon, the building began to slow in a way that only those who stayed long enough could notice, the sharp edges of urgency softening into quieter movements, conversations lowering, footsteps less precise, as if the day itself was exhaling after holding its breath for too many hours. On the 42nd floor, Evelyn Carter stood near the glass wall of her office, the city stretching endlessly beyond her, but her focus remained inward, circling the same absence that had followed her since morning. The bracelet was not just missing, it was unresolved, and that unsettled her more than any missed deal or delayed decision ever could. Security had already reviewed the footage, angles from the lobby, the elevators, the entrances, each frame examined with professional detachment, but the result had been the same, inconclusive, incomplete, another gap she could not immediately close. It may have been picked up by maintenance staff, her assistant had offered carefully, standing just inside the doorway, unsure how much to say. Evelyn did not respond right away. She did not like uncertainty, and she liked even less the idea that something personal had slipped into the hands of someone she had not chosen, someone outside her control. "If someone found it," she said finally, her voice even but quieter than usual, "they would have reported it." It was not a question. It was an expectation shaped by the world she operated in, where systems existed to ensure order, where people followed protocol, where nothing important simply disappeared without explanation. Downstairs, Marcus Reed was finishing his last round on the main floor, his movements unchanged, steady, unremarkable, his presence blending into the background as it always did. The bracelet remained where it had been all day, resting securely in the inside pocket of his jacket, not hidden, not displayed, simply kept. He had passed the front desk more than once, seen the subtle tension in the way staff spoke to each other, the quiet shift in tone that signaled something out of place, but no one had approached him, no one had asked, and he had not offered. Not yet. Timing mattered, not because he wanted to create a moment, but because he understood that some actions carried more weight when they were not rushed into noise. As he guided his cart toward the service corridor, he paused briefly, his hand resting on the handle, his gaze lifting toward the elevator again, watching as another group stepped out, their conversations trailing behind them. For a brief second, he considered leaving the bracelet at the front desk, letting it pass through the system that people trusted, letting it become just another item logged and returned without meaning. But something about that felt incomplete. It was not about recognition. It was not about being thanked. It was about responsibility, about finishing what had started the moment he chose to pick it up. Upstairs, Evelyn moved back to her desk, her fingers resting lightly against the surface as she looked down at the empty space where her wrist would normally catch her attention without thought. For the first time that day, she allowed herself to sit, not to work, not to review, but to pause, her posture still composed, but her mind no longer racing forward. Somewhere in the building, the answer already existed. She just had not found the person holding it. And somewhere between floors, separated by glass, steel, and assumption, a quiet decision was approaching its moment, not driven by pressure, not influenced by expectation, but guided by something far simpler, the belief that doing the right thing did not require permission, only timing. The decision did not arrive all at once. It settled into Marcus quietly, like something that had already been made long before he became aware of it. By early evening, the building had thinned out, the steady flow of movement replaced by isolated footsteps and distant elevator chimes that echoed longer than they had in the morning. The light had changed too, softer now, slipping through the glass in longer angles, stretching shadows across the polished floors that Marcus had already cleaned twice that day. He stood for a moment near the service corridor, his cart parked neatly against the wall, his jacket resting lightly on his shoulders, the weight in his inside pocket unchanged but no longer undecided. He reached in, fingers closing around the bracelet again, feeling its shape without looking, as if confirming something that did not need to be seen to be understood. Around him, the building no longer demanded attention, no longer rushed him, and in that quiet, the timing became clear. Upstairs, Evelyn Carter remained in her office, though the pace of her work had slowed in ways no one else would notice. Her desk was still organized, her schedule still intact, but her focus had shifted, pulled back again and again to the same absence, the same unanswered question that had followed her since morning. She had stopped asking her assistant for updates, stopped checking her phone, for messages that had not come, not because she had given up, but because she had reached the edge of what control could offer. For someone who had built her life on precision, on certainty, on knowing exactly where everything belonged, this small loss had created a space she could not immediately fill. A soft knock at the door interrupted the stillness, so light it almost blended into the quiet of the room. Evelyn did not look up right away. "Come in," she said, her voice steady, expecting another routine interruption, another detail to approve or dismiss. The door opened slowly, without urgency, and for a brief second, she did not recognize the man who stepped inside, not because he was unfamiliar, but because she had never expected to see him there. Marcus Reed stood just inside the doorway, not crossing fully into the room, his posture relaxed but respectful, his presence calm in a way that did not compete with the space around him. He did not speak immediately. He simply waited until her eyes met his, giving her the chance to place him, to remember. There was a flicker of recognition, followed quickly by something else, something less defined, a faint echo of the morning that had not stayed with her until now. "Yes," she said, her tone neutral, but no longer dismissive, just cautious, measured. Marcus took a single step forward, not enough to close the distance, just enough to be clear in his intention. Without explanation, without preface, he reached into his jacket and brought out the bracelet, holding it carefully in his open palm, not extended fully toward her, just offered in the space between them. "I believe this belongs to you," he said, his voice even, quiet, carrying no trace of expectation. For a moment, Evelyn did not move. Her eyes dropped to the object in his hand, and the room seemed to narrow around that single point, the gold catching the fading light in a way that made everything else feel distant. She stepped closer, slower than she had moved all day, her hand reaching out with a precision that was no longer about control, but about something closer to recognition. When her fingers closed around the bracelet, they lingered there for a fraction longer than necessary, as if confirming its reality, as if grounding herself in something she had almost lost without understanding why it mattered so much. And in that quiet exchange, without raised voices, without apology, something shifted, not in the room, not in the building, but in the space between two people who had not seen each other clearly until now. For a brief moment after the bracelet changed hands, neither of them spoke, and the silence did not feel empty. It felt precise, like something fragile had just been placed between them, and neither wanted to disturb it too quickly. Evelyn Carter stood with the bracelet resting in her palm, her fingers slowly curling around it, as if the simple act of holding it required more care than she remembered. Up close, the details were clearer, the faint wear along the clasp, the subtle warmth it seemed to carry, and for the first time that day, her shoulders lowered, not dramatically, just enough to release something she had been holding without noticing. She lifted her gaze back to Marcus Reed, studying him now with a different kind of attention, not the quick assessment she had given him in the lobby, but something quieter, something that asked without speaking. "You found it," she said, her voice softer than before, not questioning, just acknowledging what stood in front of her. Marcus nodded once, a small movement, nothing added, nothing emphasized. "It was on the floor," he replied, his tone steady, as if the explanation did not require more than that. There was no mention of the time he had held on to it, no explanation of why he had not turned it in, no attempt to frame his choice as anything more than what it was. Evelyn's eyes lingered on him for a second longer, as if waiting for something else, some hint of expectation, but there was none. He did not shift his weight, did not fill the silence, did not ask for recognition. He simply stood there, present, calm, unchanged. "Most people would have brought it to security," she said after a moment, the words coming out more reflective than accusatory. Marcus considered that briefly, his gaze steady but not fixed. "Maybe," he said, then paused just long enough to let the thought settle before adding, "I figured it would get back to you faster this way." There was no pride in the statement, no attempt to impress, just a simple reasoning delivered without decoration. Evelyn let out a quiet breath, almost imperceptible, her thumb brushing lightly over the surface of the bracelet as if grounding herself in something familiar. "Do you know what this is?" she asked, not looking away from it. Marcus shook his head gently. "No, ma'am." She nodded, as if that answer made sense, as if it confirmed something she had already assumed. "It was my mother's," she said, the words measured, controlled, but carrying a weight that did not need to be explained further. The room seemed to hold that information differently, the air shifting in a way that made everything else feel less immediate. Marcus did not respond right away. He did not offer sympathy, did not change his posture, did not step closer. He simply listened, allowing the meaning to exist without trying to shape it. "She gave it to me before I left for my first job," Evelyn continued, her voice steady but quieter now, as if speaking less to him and more to the memory itself. "I have not taken it off since." The admission lingered between them, not dramatic, not heavy, just honest. Marcus nodded once, a small acknowledgement, not of the story, but of the importance behind it. "I am glad you have it back," he said, his tone unchanged, but the words carrying a quiet sincerity that did not need emphasis. Evelyn looked up at him again, really looked this time, as if trying to reconcile the man standing in front of her with the version she had dismissed just hours earlier. There was no trace of resentment in his expression, no lingering edge from the morning, no demand for anything in return. Just a man who had seen something that mattered and chose to return it. And in that realization, something inside her shifted again, not suddenly, not completely, but enough to make her aware that the way she had seen him before was no longer sufficient. Marcus lingered near the doorway a moment longer than necessary, not out of hesitation, but out of an understanding that some exchanges carried weight in their silence. Evelyn still held the bracelet loosely in her hand, turning it gently between her fingers, observing the small scratches, the faint discoloration that gave it character, each imperfection telling a story she had almost forgotten. She looked up at him, this man she had seen as nothing more than part of the background of her day, and for the first time noticed how his posture, simple and composed, spoke of a quiet strength that did not seek recognition, a dignity that did not demand attention. "You did not have to hold on to it," she said softly, her voice carrying more curiosity than accusation. Marcus shook his head, his expression calm. "I wanted to make sure it reached you safely," he replied, his tone matter-of-fact, free of pride, free of expectation. There was a pause, the kind that stretches time without effort, where the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Evelyn studied him, noting how different he was from anyone else she had encountered, how his calm presence seemed to anchor the space rather than disrupt it. She realized in that moment that he had acted with thoughtfulness, with principle, without seeking validation, and it unsettled her, not because it challenged her, but because it reminded her of something she had lost along the way. The simplicity of trust and the unspoken promise that some people could be relied upon to do the right thing without being told. She moved slightly, placing the bracelet on her desk, then folding her hands in front of her, creating a small boundary between them while also acknowledging his presence. Marcus nodded once, a gesture that acknowledged her recognition without changing the balance of the room. He did not linger unnecessarily, but he did not rush, allowing the quiet tension to resolve naturally. For the first time, Evelyn allowed herself to feel a subtle shift in perspective, a recognition of the humanity in someone she had previously underestimated. The sound of the elevator arriving at the floor below broke the delicate pause, and Marcus turned toward it, a small smile brushing his lips as he adjusted his jacket. He left the office with the same composed steps that had defined him all day, moving with certainty but without fanfare, his presence leaving an unspoken impression that lingered longer than words could. Evelyn watched him go, her eyes settling on the bracelet, then back to the empty doorway, sensing that something had changed quietly, fundamentally, not in the world around her, but within herself. She remained standing for a moment longer, feeling a calmness she had not known she needed, a softening that did not diminish her strength, only made it more human. The city beyond the windows continued its rhythm, but inside the office, in that moment, the echoes of a small act of thoughtfulness had created a space where trust and recognition could exist without explanation, a quiet resonance that would linger well beyond the day, shaping the way she would move forward with both care and understanding in the days to come. As the evening deepened, the office took on a different hue, the artificial lights softening against the darkening city outside, creating reflections on the glass that made the room feel suspended in its own quiet world. Evelyn Carter sat back in her chair, the bracelet resting on her desk, the small object now a tether between her thoughts and the morning's events. She traced the chain with her fingertips, letting the sensation anchor her, reminding her that some things, though lost, could return without fanfare, without announcement, simply because someone cared enough to act with patience and integrity. The silence was not uncomfortable, it was deliberate, allowing her to process the shift she had not expected, a shift that softened her perception of the man who had returned the bracelet. Marcus Reed had disappeared from her line of sight, his work completed, his presence behind her now only a memory, yet the effect lingered in the air as tangibly as the scent of the polished floor and industrial cleaner that had followed him earlier in the day. She realized how rarely she had experienced an interaction uncolored by obligation, by hierarchy, by expectation. This moment was neither about authority nor status. It was about a simple, human choice executed with quiet attention and unwavering respect. She found herself imagining his perspective, the hallway empty, the bracelet in his hand, the decision not to return it immediately, not because he wished to assert power, but because he understood the timing mattered, because he approached responsibility with care. It struck her as unusual, rare, a behavior so grounded in principle that it transcended her own assumptions about the world and the people in it. She leaned slightly forward, her elbows resting on the polished surface, considering the morning, the hallway, the glance that had first unsettled her, the words exchanged that carried so little weight, but so much meaning. The building continued its rhythm around her, distant elevators chiming, security staff moving with quiet efficiency, the city lights beginning to sparkle through the windows. As dusk fully arrived, yet none of that intruded on the clarity of the moment she was experiencing. Marcus's actions had introduced an unspoken lesson into her day, a demonstration of care and dignity executed without spectacle, without expectation of reward, that resonated more profoundly than any presentation or meeting could. She reflected on how easily people could overlook the subtleties of kindness, the power of small acts to realign perception, to remind someone of the inherent decency still present in the world. Her fingers lingered on the bracelet, and she allowed herself to acknowledge the quiet gratitude that had not yet found words, a sense of respect for the composure, for the timing, for the intentional simplicity of Marcus Reed's choices. The office remained still, the lights casting long shadows across the floor, the city outside a backdrop of constant motion that contrasted with the deliberate stillness of her contemplation. For the first time in days, she breathed fully, letting the tension she had carried for weeks ease, her thoughts settling into a recognition that the smallest gestures, executed with patience and principle, could resonate more profoundly than any of the accolades or authority she had accumulated. And somewhere below, moving quietly through the emptying lobby, Marcus continued his rounds, unaware of the depth of the effect he had left, carrying on with the same care, the same steady attention to detail, the same quiet dignity that had changed a moment, and perhaps a perspective, in the life of someone he barely knew. The next morning arrived quietly, sunlight slipping through the tall windows and scattering across the polished floors, turning the lobby into a canvas of light and shadow. Evelyn Carter arrived earlier than usual, her heels clicking softly against the marble, her mind preoccupied not with meetings or deadlines, but with the faint imprint of yesterday's encounter. She had placed the bracelet carefully on her wrist, feeling its weight, not in gold or metal, but in the quiet reminder of integrity and patience. As she walked through the lobby, her eyes unconsciously scanned for Marcus Reed, not for any reason other than curiosity, a hope to acknowledge the person whose actions had subtly shifted the perspective she carried into every interaction. Downstairs, Marcus moved with the same steady rhythm, the hum of the day beginning to pick up around him, yet he remained insulated in his own careful routine, noticing small details others overlooked, ensuring the floors were pristine, the signs aligned, the spaces orderly, as if the environment itself deserved attention and respect. When their paths converged near the central elevators, Evelyn paused briefly, just enough for him to look up, their eyes meeting across the polished floor. No words were exchanged initially, the moment carrying more weight in its silence than any conversation could have produced. He nodded slightly, acknowledging her presence, and she returned the gesture, subtle but deliberate, a recognition of mutual understanding that had taken shape without fanfare. The day continued around them, the rhythm of office life pressing forward, yet within that pause, a space existed where hierarchy did not matter, where status was irrelevant, where one simple act had realigned perception, creating a bridge between two people who had previously occupied separate worlds. Marcus continued his work, quietly and efficiently, and Evelyn watched for a moment, taking note of his methodical movements, the calm assurance he exuded, realizing that such presence was rare, a kind of strength that required no demonstration, no announcement. She returned to her office, allowing herself a deep breath, the tension she had carried for weeks easing ever so slightly, replaced by reflection on what she had witnessed. The bracelet on her wrist was more than a recovered possession. It was a symbol, an emblem of small, deliberate acts that could resonate far beyond the immediate moment. She considered the morning ahead, the meetings, the decisions, and the flow of people through the building. But she carried with her a sense of clarity, an understanding that the simplest gestures, offered without expectation, could influence perception and behavior in ways she had rarely experienced. Marcus passed through the lobby once more, catching her gaze briefly, and for the first time, Evelyn allowed herself to smile faintly, a small acknowledgement of the quiet impact of a man whose presence had reminded her of the dignity and patience, the value in observation, and the power inherent in choosing to act rightly when no one was watching. The city outside continued its ceaseless rhythm. Elevators moved up and down, voices whispered, and life went on. But within the lobby and the office, a subtle change lingered, a quiet resonance from one moment that had the capacity to shape the way both would navigate the world around them from that day forward. As the sun dipped lower, casting long, golden streaks across the city, Evelyn Carter lingered at her desk, the bracelet resting on her wrist as a quiet reminder of the unexpected interaction that had unfolded over the past day. She watched the light shift, reflecting off the windows and the polished surfaces of her office, and felt a calmness settle in a way she had not anticipated. Each movement of her hand over the bracelet was deliberate, measured, grounding her in the present and anchoring her thoughts away from the constant pull of decisions, meetings, and deadlines. The memory of Marcus Reed, his steady posture, his calm composure, and the quiet dignity with which he had returned what was lost, lingered more vividly than any email or report she had reviewed that day. She realized that his actions had spoken in ways words often could not, teaching without lecture, guiding without assertion, and reminding her that patience and integrity could hold as much power as authority and wealth. Downstairs, Marcus continued his work, methodical, quiet, attentive to details others rarely noticed, moving through spaces with a rhythm that was almost meditative, each step measured, each task completed with care, yet without ostentation. The building itself seemed to take on a different tone, the usual hum of activity, softened by the presence of someone who approached life with steady observation rather than noise. Evelyn's eyes occasionally drifted to the lobby through the large glass panels, her gaze seeking but not expecting, acknowledging that the simplest gestures could leave the deepest impressions. She considered the nature of her own day, her expectations, and the assumptions she had held about people she thought she knew by their appearance or their role, and recognized a shift within herself, subtle but undeniable, a quiet opening of perspective that had been long overdue. The city beyond the windows continued its steady rhythm, cars moving in patterned flow, distant horns echoing, pedestrians threading through the streets, all oblivious to the small but significant exchange that had occurred in one office, one lobby, one brief intersection of lives. And in the office, in the reflective silence after action and reaction had passed, Evelyn allowed herself to carry forward not only the bracelet, but also the understanding that moments of kindness, executed with calm resolve, could resonate beyond their immediate context, creating ripples that changed perception, behavior, and understanding in ways that could not always be anticipated. Somewhere below, Marcus moved past the elevators, unseen yet undeniably present, his rounds continuing as though nothing had shifted, yet everything had changed in the eyes of someone who had observed and felt the quiet weight of his choices. In that convergence of ordinary spaces and extraordinary character, a subtle but lasting connection had been forged, one that required no words, no recognition, no fanfare, only the presence of two people honoring the power of integrity, attention, and timing, leaving a quiet resonance that would influence not just the day, but the way both moved through the world from that point forward.